All right, you guys, this is part 3 of your unit 7.4. 7.4 PowerPoint on the end of Reconstruction. We were talking about Jim Crow laws. Okay, so Jim Crow laws were legal segregation. Segregation is separating two groups of people. Okay, most public places had this separation of these two groups. Okay, and so yeah, Jim Crow laws, just another way to keep African Americans separate, to violate their civil rights, really, okay, to stop them from being equal, along with black codes and white supremacy groups like the KKK and, you know, other things. Democrats always winning all these elections and everything. So after Reconstruction ends, any gains that African Americans had kind of, you know, made had really taken a backwards toll. Sharecropping, no bueno. Okay, KKK, super no bueno. Segregation and Jim Crow laws, no bueno. Black codes, no bueno. Okay, so everything's kind of going to start going backwards for them. Again, they also start the poll taxing and the grandfather clauses and the literacy tests and stuff with voting. Yeah, just horrendous treatment. An example of how much voting is impacted, and you guys got to remember the population down south, right? Some of these states, they have more African Americans living in the state than they have white people. So the African American vote matters and could totally change the course of an election for sure in a lot of these southern states. During Reconstruction, okay, while there is a military presence and people paying attention to what the South is doing, 90% of voting-aged African-American men were registered to vote, and most of them were actively voting. When you get to the end of Reconstruction, that it's done, the military's gone now, right, and we move past Reconstruction into the 1880s and the 1890s, less and less African Americans are voting because of threats on their life, because of lynching, because of poll taxes and grandfather clauses and literacy tests that have been put into place by the South to help keep control of the African American population. And you go from over 90% of African Americans registering to vote down to under 10%. It's a huge decrease from 90 to less than 10 because of all of the pressures and threats and tests and money and everything involved with voting. So Jim Crow, okay, very influential through all the way up to present times, guys. Take a look at some of these Jim Crow videos. You want to understand segregation and Jim Crow for sure. Okay, we had this on the 7.3 PowerPoint, but in case you didn't get to take the time, again, those literacy tests went all the way up through the 1960s. People in your life were alive, not all of them, but some of them were alive when these literacy tests were a thing, stopping people from voting. So if you didn't look last time, push pause and take a look this time at some of these questions. Just ridiculous, okay? Yeah, things like draw a triangle with a blackened circle that overlaps its left corner. Like, what? Draw a line from circle 2 to circle 5 that will pass below circle 3 and above circle 4. Like, just things that are purposely confusing. If you missed one question, you couldn't vote, okay? Again, this video clip page was on the last PowerPoint, but if you didn't take a look at it then, or you only took a look at a couple, then take a look at a couple more, okay, about ways they were trying to stop African Americans from voting. All right, moving on. Draw a line, draw a line, draw a line from everything from Q8. Oh, sorry if you heard that. I just had an emergency alert on my phone. Okay, so Q8, Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, so you should know by the title that this is going to be about a court case. This court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, is going to ultimately make it all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So what happened? Okay, just like black codes, there wasn't one law that was a black code. There was dozens and dozens of black codes that sometimes varied from state to state in the South. Jim Crow laws were the same. So Jim Crow laws wasn't one set of laws. It wasn't just like 10 laws everybody followed. It wasn't one law. Jim Crow laws, there were dozens of them, you guys, and sometimes they varied from state to state. All right, well, one Jim Crow law in Louisiana, remember they're about segregation, separating black and white population, was the Separate Railroad Car Act. So that's the name of the Jim Crow law, the Separate Railroad Car Act. And what it did, if you think about it, you can probably figure it out, it segregated train rail cars, where certain train cars, right, were for African American passengers, and other ones were for white passengers, because Jim Crow laws said, hey, equal but separate accommodations were not infringing on your civil rights. You are having equal rights because these are equal accommodations. They're just separate, okay, for black and white passengers. So, of course, many African Americans do not like segregation laws. They think Jim Crow laws are unconstitutional, which by today's standards, they totally were, okay? But, you know, viewpoints have changed over time. Not everybody would have had that opinion back then. And so there's a guy named Homer Plessy who in 1892 purposely sits in a whites-only train car, okay? He's Creole. For those of you guys that don't know what Creole is, it's a mixed-race person from European and African descent. So he's not even full black. He is part white. In fact, he is 7/8 white and only 1/8 black, according to his heritage, okay? But he is a mixed race person. He sits in the white car of this train in Louisiana, and he is asked to move. He refuses to do so and ultimately is arrested. He's done this on purpose to prove a point, you know, that he thinks these Jim Crow laws are unfair. So he sues, claiming that his 13th and 14th Amendments rights were being violated. Okay, remember 13th is about slavery, 14th is about equal protection and citizenship under the law. And so he's saying those rights are being violated. Plessy Ferguson takes 4 years, but it makes it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in a 7-1 vote, you guys, so almost a landslide vote, okay? Almost everyone at the time in the U.S. Supreme Court votes that Homer Plessy is wrong, okay? That state laws that are Jim Crow laws, like the Separate Car Act, do not force people into slavery, okay? Just because we're having you sit in a separate car, we're not forcing you into slavery. So your 13th Amendment right is not being violated. Also, yes, the facilities in the train are separate, but they are equal. And therefore, your 14th Amendment right of equal protection of the law and equal rights as a citizen are not being violated. You're just being segregated out. So equal but separate is okay, says the U.S. Supreme Court at the time in 1896. Okay, so in short, what this does, you guys, is the judges conclude that segregation, separating out black and whites, is a legal form of discrimination. You can legally, it is okay to discriminate people as long as you hide behind Jim Crow, equal but separate. And it reinforces the precedent that segregation is acceptable, that it should be okay, that Jim Crow laws are okay. So of course, once this happens, I'm sure you guys, it doesn't take rocket science to figure out, Jim Crow laws explode throughout the South. There were already a lot anyway, and they just intensify exponentially in number with all of these separate but equal laws, like the Separate Railroad Car Act, for example, okay? A lot more like that end up getting passed. Here's the thing, over time, separate but equal, they stretch the definition of equal past its limits, okay? So separate but equal does not mean that the white diners at this restaurant are going to get a 5-star, meal with a decent price and be treated wonderfully, and that blacks, while having to sit in a separate area, will also get a 5-star meal at a reasonable price and get treated wonderfully. No, it stopped meaning that. What it started to mean is that African Americans were often exposed to way worse conditions, like schools is a really good example. White schools, clean, new equipment, new textbooks, nice desks and things like that, while African American schools would get dilapidated, broken down, used, thrown out things from white schools with pages missing and, things carved into the desks and all that kind of stuff. So, hey, you have a school, you have books, and you have desks, so it's equal. But no, it's not. These textbooks are 50 years old and, missing huge chunks of pages and stuff. So they really would spread the definition of equal way past what it really meant. So it turned into Jim Crow not being separate and equal. It was separate and super not equal, like way not equal, okay, with African Americans always getting the short end of the stick, okay, and whites' property and entrances and choices always being much fancier and nicer than what African Americans had access to. Okay, make sure you give yourself a good left-hand side question. And this was a horrible decision on the part of the Supreme Court, legalizing discrimination, legalizing racism. It's saying it's okay as long as it's separate and equal. But it never was equal, guys, ever, ever. Okay, African Americans, again, just getting pushed down by the whites for so long, and all they're trying to do is better themselves, right? All right, draw a line, draw a line, draw a line underneath everything you just wrote all the way across your page. All right, Q9, racism in full force. Highlight, highlight, highlight that yellow. Get this written down. Make sure you're busting out your super duper, very important highlighter color. All right, so what's the deal? Okay, again, Reconstruction's over. Things are really kind of going downhill for the poor African Americans that are just trying to catch a break, just trying to find their way and move up that, socioeconomic ladder, okay? Segregation just supports discrimination. It supports the idea that whites of European ancestry are somehow superior to other races, including African Americans. Whites started believing that non-whites had no business being in American politics, that they were justified in keeping, poll taxes and grandfather clauses and literacy tests and everything in effect. They were justified in having tension around voting and around the treatment of white people versus black people. And the whites in the South really kind of start romanticizing the Confederacy period from about 40 years before, remembering the good old days when African Americans knew their place and were our slaves, and really started romanticizing what that was all about, and that was justified and it should be brought back, kind of a thing. And things in popular culture at the time also piggyback on romanticizing this idea that whites should be supreme. Okay, motion pictures had started at this point. They don't have sound yet. Okay, they're black and white. Very few special effects and those kind of things, but they did exist, the first versions of them. And a guy named D.W. Griffith, he creates a film called The Birth of a Nation. And in this movie, the KKK are portrayed as heroes. They're the heroes of the story that liberate the South, that free the South from corrupt African Americans who are trying to come in and get out of their place and take over society in bad ways. And this movie, Birth of a Nation, was extremely popular, especially obviously in the South by white viewers. And so this leads to things like the KKK rising again. Remember, I told you the KKK came up into existence during Reconstruction, and then the US military comes in and really kind of pounds them almost out of existence, and they kind of go underground and lose a lot of members. But then we get into the late 1800s and into the 1900s, all the way up through the 1930s and 40s, and the KKK will see a spike again in membership, reaching over 3 million members in the KKK by 1920, who were all about white supremacy and keeping blacks in their lower place in society and not letting them rise up and, wanting white power. Just horrific, just a travesty for sure. So again, violence breaks out, right? Not just by the KKK, but in general, just violence in the South. In a 20-year period after Reconstruction's over in the late 1800s to early 1900s, there's over 4,000 lynchings of African Americans, guys. Again, that's when you're hung in public, right? And really, most of the time, it's white people lynching black people in public, and nothing was done. because the people in charge, you know, at the police department and at the mayor's office and on the city council and even the governors of the state or whatever were all racist Democrats at the time. Not that all Democrats are racist, I'm not saying that, okay, but at the time they were racist and they were Democrats and they all covered each other's butts.